Hey, it's the Ultimate Handyman. I'm doing some work on my 1997 Dodge Ram with a Cummins 12 valve in it, and I need to replace the timing case gasket. And to get the timing case off, you need to take off the camshaft gear or remove the cam out of the truck completely. And I wasn't really up for that task, so I opted to take the gear off while the cam stayed in the truck. And I'm going to show you step by step how to remove the gear and reinstall it. So the first thing I had to do was pull the cam gear off the truck. I opted to use a steering wheel puller that I had. I ended up buying some 3/8 by I think 4-inch long grade 8 bolts and some decorative washers at Ace Hardware. Now some of the washers had to be cut down on the sides, so I just sanded the sides down so they would fit inside the grooves or the slots in the cam gear. And then two of the bolts, I had to shave one side of the head of the bolt down so it would fit past the retaining bolts that hold the camshaft in. I'll show you that right here. So the first one I didn't have to shave. The second and third bolt I needed to trim down to clear those retaining bolts, or the heads of them, and those will slide in like so. They'll fit right in that groove. And then you can see where I shaved it down, it just slides right past that bolt head and into place. And then the same goes for the remaining puller bolt. I also wanted to mention that they do make a specific puller to take this gear off, but it's hundreds and hundreds of dollars, and I was trying to save a few bucks here. So in order to get this cam gear off, you're going to need to use a combination of your steering wheel puller and a heat source. So I'm using a MAP gas torch, and I just basically went around in circles around the gear, heating it up evenly, and putting pressure on that steering wheel puller. Putting heat, putting pressure, and you just keep doing that until the gear breaks loose. You'll hear it when it breaks loose. It makes a pretty good little sound. And after that, the gear came off much easier. I didn't have to put as much heat. I basically could wrench on that ratchet for quite a while, and then eventually it would kind of slow down. I put a little more heat, and then finally the gear came off of the truck. So once the gear came off, I was able to take apart my timing case. I cleaned up all the gaskets and reinstalled the case with a brand new gasket, and hopefully this thing will never leak. All right, so this next step is really important. You're going to want to pin the camshaft in place. But before you pin it in place, you want to make sure that it's all the way seated against that retainer plate that holds the cam into the engine block. I just use a pry bar for that. Now the next step is we're going to take a 3/8 piece of steel. I had this lying around, luckily. And we're going to wedge that in between one of the cam lobes and part of the engine block. And that is what's going to hold the cam in place while we're pounding that gear on, and that will keep it from moving through the back of the motor. Now, if you don't do this, the cam is only held in by that retainer plate in the front, and that keeps the cam from going forward out of the engine block. And the gear that's supposed to be installed in the cam is what keeps it from going through the back of the motor. Now, at the back of the camshaft, there's a plug that I think they use it for machining purposes, and it's only made out of sheet metal. You can knock that out if you don't do this process. So make sure that you hold that cam in place. And just to be safe, I installed two of these pieces of steel in between the cam lobes and the engine block to hold it in place, and I clamped them down using some vice grip pliers just to make sure they didn't fall out while I was hitting. And that actually worked out perfectly. I didn't have any problems with that, and that should do the trick for you. I have heard of guys taking the lift pump out and sticking a pry bar onto the camshaft and having someone else hold it, but that to me seems kind of risky because the pry bars kind of flex and move, and it takes a lot of force to drive that cam gear on. So I would definitely take the oil pan off. I was taking mine off anyways to replace the gasket, and that made it much easier. As you can see, it's seated about maybe about a 1/4 inch up, maybe an 1/8 inch on the first one, and then the second one caught the whole cam lobe, which gave it even more strength. You can see it's wedged against that casting on the engine block, and that should keep everything from moving. All right, so I heated the cam gear up in the oven to make it easier to slide onto the cam. Now I heated the oven to 350 my first attempt. This took me 3 tries to get the gear on, by the way. First attempt failed. It got hung up on another gear that wasn't quite aligned. Second attempt failed because I couldn't get it started, so I decided to heat the oven up to 450 degrees for 1 hour. And when I pulled the gear out, it actually was about 350 degrees, so you'd have to leave it in the oven way longer to get it to that temperature. And to keep the gear warm while I'm transferring it from the oven to the house, I made this little insulated pan. I used some leftover house insulation wrapped around one of those like aluminum cooking pans, and that worked quite well. Now, before I installed the gear on the motor, right before I pulled it out of the oven, I chilled the cam down with some computer duster turned upside down, and that blasted the cold refrigerant all over the camshaft. Doing this should make it a lot easier to get the gear back on the cam. I wanted to mention that make sure that there is no oil on the gear or on the camshaft. This stuff has to be really clean because it's a press fit and you do not want any kind of oil or lubricant in between those parts. So this was my third and final attempt at installing the cam gear. So while I was taking it out of the oven, I put a bag of ice on the cam to keep it nice and cool. So here's me removing the clamp that was holding the bag. Now, to keep my hands from getting burned while handling that gear, I put on, I think I had 3 pairs of gloves on. I had a pair of rubber gloves, doesn't really do too much. I had a pair of mechanics gloves and some Lincoln welding gloves. The welding gloves worked really well. After about maybe 45 seconds to a minute, you kind of start to feel the heat from that gear, but you can kind of leapfrog your hands back and forth on the gear to keep yourself from getting burned. So it took me about 3 or 4 tries to get the gear lined up with the keyway and the vacuum pump and power steering pump gear. And once I got everything started, I was able to start tapping it on with a brass hammer. So I wanted to mention to you guys a little tip that would have made my job a little bit easier. If you are doing this type of work, I recommend taking apart the whole front of the truck. Take the bumper, the AC components, you can pull those off and swing them up and hang them from the hood without draining the system or vacuuming the system out. You can pull the intercooler and the radiator, get that out of the way. That way you have access to the whole front of the motor. And it would have made my job go a lot smoother, just disassembling everything and trying to take the gear off and put it back on. I think part of my problem was I didn't have enough power behind my hammer blows, so I wasn't able to get the gear on quick enough. And what happened is the gear cooled off too much, and then I had to reheat it with a torch and then tap it with the brass hammer in a circular motion to get it back on. And I had to repeat this process, I don't know, quite a few times, at least probably 15 to 20 times, heating, tapping with the hammer, and I was able to get the gear almost flush with the camshaft before it stopped, and I just could not hit it hard enough to get it to go on all the way. So then I ended up taking the whole front end of the truck off, and that really helped me out a lot. So I want to give you a close-up shot of the cam gear. So I was able to get it almost on. I've still got the 1/8 of an inch to go. You can see where I'm hitting it with the brass hammer, where it's that golden brassy looking color. Make sure you hit it in a circular motion right where that is. Don't hit the middle of the gear or on the outside where the gear teeth are. Be very careful because you could damage the gear. During this whole process, you need to make sure that the cam and the motor do not move. So make sure that your timing marks align. Where the 0, I got the 0 on the bottom and the 00 on the cam gear, and everything should be good. So after working on this gear for hours and hours, I finally got it fully seated onto the camshaft. Now the last 1/8 of an inch was by far the hardest part of the job. For some reason, it would only move just a hair at a time. And I did try a few different techniques. I tried using an air hammer to drive it in, and that didn't work. I tried putting a collar over the shaft itself and against the gear and pounding it on. That didn't work. So I ended up just hitting it at an angle with my brass hammer and just adding heat. And that was enough to move it just a little bit at a time. Literally, it would only move like either a hair or maybe a 30-second at the most, or sometimes it wouldn't move at all. And I probably did this at least 12 times to get it on, and finally got it. So I spent the next day putting the engine back together and the front of the truck. And while I was doing that, I also put a tab on my killer dowel pin. It's a really good time to do that job. That'll keep your engine safe from that pin. And then I had a job the next day after that over in Lake Tahoe. But first I had to make a pit stop in Reno to pick up some supplies. Then I headed over the pass from Reno to Incline Village at Lake Tahoe to do some work. And the truck drove flawlessly. I didn't have any problems. I was a little worried at first, you know, doing all that work and beating on the cam gear, that something could go wrong. But all in all, everything has been working perfectly. I think I've got about 600 miles on the truck so far. And yeah, everything's great. And the best part about this, I have no oil leaks. That was really the main purpose for taking that gear off in the first place, is so I could get to the timing case cover and repair all that. So I hope you found this video helpful. That's kind of why I made it. I wanted to help someone else out there that has to deal with the same problem. If you did find it helpful, can you please do me a huge favor? Please like, share, and subscribe, and don't forget to ring the notification bell. And with that said, I really want to thank you for watching, and I will see you the next project. And oh yeah, don't forget to check out my other videos right here.